Okay, welcome to the KrakCast. There's no simple, easy way of setting up this piece. Okay, we've kicked back a few ideas. There's no real catchy title for it. I'm gonna call it The War About the Judiciary.
All right.
Y'all know what I'm talking about, I hope. The Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court, the National Council of the Judiciary. There's been some massive changes in the courts. Would that be fair to say, Mike?
That would be an understatement to say.
I think so. Yeah. I'm just, if you're listening to this right now, the main focus of this is, this is complicated. So we're going to do our best to simplify and to put as many facts on the table as we can about how this happened, what's the chronology, what's the actual politics on the ground, and what might the consequences be from these changes. What we'd like to have seen, possibly in some of the articles we've been reading over the last 6 months to a year about this, or even longer than that. I mean, it goes back to 2015. But before we do that, I think it's only right to set up a bit of background here, to talk a little bit about the handover of power from the communist system and how that was handled. And that's a huge part of the controversy. That's a huge part of the day-to-day, on-the-ground talk about this issue. So I think we're going to start there. Would that be okay, Mike?
Fair enough. I think no matter what we do, we're going to fail because it's
yeah, but we're going to try. That's what we're going to do. We're going to try right now to throw some light on this. Okay, yeah, an A for effort type of piece coming up here.
Well, we could all end up in court. Yeah.
It's fair to say as well, we've been dancing around this. I think about 12 times. We've promised some kind of legal scholar to come on and talk about this. Nobody wants to talk about this. That's what we've discovered. Okay, but we want to talk about it because it's the number one hot button issue in Polish politics. It's complicated. People are animated about this, so why wouldn't we talk about it? And to start off, I think what we need is a bit of history, Mike. Give us some background.
Okay, it depends on how far back we go, but we're talking the 80s in Poland, the end of the communist era. We had the round table agreements, the compromises. Basically, it was a non-violent transfer of power from a one-party system to a multi-party system. It was not perfect. You have to be honest about that. The communist regime still had a lot of influence on what happened in Poland in the 90s. They weren't arrested. They weren't, taken out of power as you had in other countries. They were allowed to keep going. This was considered the compromise in that system. Mm-hmm. The first elections here, which were June 4th to 89, they weren't completely free because not all the seats were empty, but all the seats that were available, Solidarność won. It was basically a sign that, communism is over in Poland. We're moving forward now. PiS, the current government, basically said that this was a sellout, that the government of that time allowed too many communists to keep their places of power, that politicians from that era were allowed to move on into the next era. You get SLD as one of the governments where, the second president of Poland, Kwaśniewski, was a freaking minister during the communist regime. So, it had some kind of ties to the past there. Mm-hmm. But then a lot of bureaucrats or people in power, the deep state, like as, the buzzword is nowadays. So, for instance, judges were people that started their careers in the 60s or 70s in the communist Poland. And basically, they just, as if, nothing had changed, kept on being judges at that time. And the truth is, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, if you became a judge or, somebody of any influence, that means you had some kind of connection with the party, with other people.
Which was how the compromise was made. It was saying, everybody who's got any knowledge of running the government is a member of the party. Ergo, we have to make some compromises here. It wasn't,
Exactly. Thanks to this, we had a bloodless revolution in Poland. But because of that, there's also people now that say, well, that's kind of slowed us down. And now you have
the judiciary, would you say it was a particularly cliquish environment where
extremely
lustracja, as they call it, the lustration process was actually like, you know what, we've got this. You don't need to do anything here.
It was based like that. Like judges chose themselves; they appointed who would be the next judge. Before you had a system where the politicians had some influence on who would become a judge, but mainly the idea was that judges would suggest a nominee, and the politicians would basically just rubber stamp them or not accept them and ask for somebody else. But the judges were the ones who would actually, nominate who would become a new judge in a new area. One of the changes that PiS wanted to bring in was to have more political accountability, where politicians from the Polish parliament would actually be allowed to choose who these judges would be. But okay, we're going off on a tangent here. We're basically starting with just a basic background, and then we're already getting complicated.
Yeah, because I think we fast forward the clock a little.
Okay, let's fast forward to where this became hyped in international.
So
media.
The first question is basically the allegation that these judges are all ex-communists. Is it true or false? The answer is it's complicated. It's very complicated. Of course, some of them are ex-communists because they wouldn't have been judges in the first place. But of course, it's a difficult job to be a judge. You need to have all this legal knowledge. You can't just, get a bunch of people off the street and say, you're the new judge. So of course, compromises were made. We fast forward. I think an important question at this point is, the mid-90s, a huge successful revolution of economics happens in this country, massive successes and absolutely great results, and there's a lot of positivity, really, isn't there? But now Poland, fast forward to 2015, it's a mature democracy. It's a country with a place in the world that's a lot different than it was back in the 90s. And these same questions just keep coming up again and again and again. And it kind of became a scab on the arm of Polish politics, the whole ex-communist thing. I mean, would you say that's fair to say? It's never really gone away?
Yeah, some politicians feel like it was something that should have been cleared out years before. Because even
if tried it the first time they were in power, didn't they?
They did as well. And their arguments, some of the arguments had merit. Because even though some politicians or people in the quote-unquote deep state may not have direct ties to the previous regime, the only reason that they're involved in politics right now is because, say, their parents or their older friends had ties. So it becomes like a continuation in a way. Like I said, it gets complicated. But PiS decided in 2015, when they gained power, is that they're going to start clearing out the bushes, kind of a resetting of the whole system.
Stables, I believe.
Something along those lines, bringing out turning the river and cleaning it all out.
So that's what I want to turn to next. Please, this is the most important part, I think, the start of... this is where PiS said, we're not just going to election on it anymore. We're going to, this is our mandate. This is what the people want. This is what they've been asking for a long time.
They ran on this. So
they had
a mandate in that sense.
And that is important. It wasn't like, it wasn't a switch and bait when they got in power. All of a sudden they started attacking the judiciary. I hate that word. They didn't just start attacking the judiciary. They ran on it, like you said. And to many people's surprise, even though the protests that we should say have been enormous, they have been regular, there has been vocal opposition from the left. They have followed through in general. Now, I'd like you to do something very difficult at this stage, Mike, is give us an overview of all the different laws that have been passed in the last few years.
Oh, man, I have a feeling in a couple of years this will be like, for law students, just, a semester worth of classes just to get this through. But, okay, we have to basically start at the beginning, oddly enough. PiS came into power in October 2015. That's October 25th, 2015. That's when they won their elections outright, one of the first times in modern-day Poland. But we have to go back even further to the spring of that year. June 25th. Sorry, that's already the beginning of summer. June 25th, 2015, PO, who was in power at that time, changed the legislation allowing them to choose members of the Constitutional Tribunal, the judges that will be on that tribunal. Members of that tribunal have a 9-year term. And the law basically said that when the term is over, the government that is in power during that ending moment is the one who chooses the replacement. The problem was with 5 judges, they were kind of in a gray area because, as we know, in parliamentary democracies, it's not one day it's one party, then the next day it's the next government. The elections are called, there's a moment where there's no government, then the new government is formed. These 5 judges were kind of in this gray area, or at least 3 of them anyway. This is, like I said, where it gets complicated. They decided that to keep things simple, they would choose all 5 judges during this gray area because, more or less, why not? So they would have some influence. What's funny is that all the judges that had been chosen previously had never been controversial. It was never a problem. It was just something that was just done. Like there was Parliament was in session. They would vote them in. It was over with. PO decided to make things complicated.
And when he says PO, just for anyone who's not
Civic Platform,
Civic Platform, Donald Tusk's party. Yes. Go ahead. Sorry.
The pro-European kind of center of left party. and the president at the time was Komorowski, also
PO as well.
PO, Civic Platform. And he decided to call the elections for October 25th. He could have called the elections for any number of dates. The 1 week earlier, the 18th or the 11th, or 1 week later, the 1st of November. The 1st of November was not an option. It's a holiday in Poland, so that's not going to happen. The 25th was the latest date possible. And because of that, PO's government would last those few weeks longer, and the next government would start a few weeks later. So all of a sudden, and three of these judges, so the government would have ended basically early October had Komorowski brought in the earlier dates, but because of this, the government sessions lasted until October, and the new government wouldn't start until the late November. Oh, God.
We're basically saying here that Platforma stuffed the bench just before they left.
Yes, and the thing is, the argument could be made that three of those judges who were ending their term on the...
And this was controversial. I believe this even
at that moment
censure from the EU at the time.
Yes, but they were quiet about it because, PO was their party here in Poland, so even if they were bending the laws to fit them, it was like, it's okay. Because none of this is actually like anybody breaking the laws. It's kind of just dick political moves, taking advantage of the system.
Procedure gone, exactly. A little naughty.
Because three of the judges would have to be elected for the 7th of November. The elections were the 25th, so 2 weeks earlier. And the two judges would have been chosen for the 3rd and 9th of December, so a lot later. But they decided to group all these together. PiS argued that, no, this doesn't work. And when they came into power the 25th, and when their government was formed the 16th, one of the first things they do was repeal the legislation that allowed PO to bring in these 5 judges.
Okay. So PiS have come into power, and it's already a thing they ran on, and now Platforma have made this huge political bomb, basically. So it's the only thing anyone in the country is talking about. Would that be fair to say? I mean, that's something that doesn't get appreciated, I think, abroad when people talk about this, is just how big an issue this was from that moment onwards. Then it became, okay, well, we are going to sort this out now. Now you want to talk about this? This is where this conversation is going to get real. And a slew of legislation has followed since. Now, the slew is what I'd like to cover next, Mike. Sorry.
Thank you.
You get all the tough jobs. The National Judiciary Council was reformed. The benchmarks for how judges are appointed were changed. Can you give us a brief overview on some of that before we talk about the Supreme Court, which is probably what, if you're listening to this, you've been kind of waiting to hear about? Don't worry, we're going to get there. As we said, this is complicated.
This is complicated, yes. And we need to underline the fact that the Constitutional Tribunal, which is what we were talking about a second ago, is separate from the Supreme High Court here, just to make sure that things are simple here. PiS basically ran on that they would reform the judiciary in every way possible. As we mentioned earlier, judges here were mainly chosen by other judges that were nominated with very limited political influence. PiS decided to change that. They actually wanted the parliamentarians, so members of the Sejm, who were voted in by everybody, to have some kind of influence on who would be the judges, because there was no political accountability on judges before that. They were just chosen by their own clique, by their own friends. So they introduced some concepts under pressure from cookies and other political groups. They agreed to the fact that it had to be a 2/3 majority, not a simple majority, but at least a 2/3 majority, which sounds kind of sensible. You don't want this to be a situation where one party has a say, but you want some kind of consensus.
The 2/3 principle traditionally being seen as classic democratic principle.
Exactly. And the funny thing is, like, when PiS agreed to this, they realized the fact that the next government that comes in would also be able to bring in changes to the judges there. This wouldn't be that PiS, introduced their own judges and they're there forever.
Always important to point out that.
Exactly.
If you change the rules and then lose the next election, the rules then work for your opponent.
Exactly. So, these rules would have worked for anybody, any government that would have come afterwards. This basically meant that the KRS, so the National Judiciary Council, or whatever we decide to call it, because we don't know how to translate these things.
That's what we're calling them, Mike.
Would have been chosen to a large extent by members of parliament, contrary to what it used to be. And this is the council that decides on or nominates who will be the judge in
judges who choose
in your local area, in the voivoda, or even the the Supreme Court. But every time they introduced a law changing this, the opposition parties would protest, would scream. So PiS would bring in a law kind of changing it to appease the opposition, but the opposition would say, no, but you're basing this new law on a different false law that we don't agree with, so the new law also doesn't count. And this just became a chain of laws that were based on previous laws that the opposition would say were invalid anyway. It just became very, very complicated. And you get a situation where you have like judges that were chosen by one system working at the same time as judges that were chosen with the other system, and people would argue who had supremacy in the situation.
So could I ask, is there now a different procedure for appointing judges?
No, there isn't. There is the system that was introduced by the government. The only problem is, like, one of the courts that used to exist, the Constitutional Tribunal, to kind of fix these issues, well, a lot of people in the opposition don't consider their choices legitimate anyway, so it's kind of stuck. We've gotten to the point right now where the situation is no longer a legal problem. I mean, it's legal, of course, but you can no longer fix it with any type of amendments or laws. This is a point where you have to actually get all the stakeholders and stockholders together. It's a political problem right now. And the other side just doesn't want to come to any kind of compromise, or they don't want to reset the system. So it's going to be a complete war forever unless the other side says, okay, we'll go with this if you bring in this, this, and this. But they don't
just to be clear, we've no idea how to unscramble that egg. But yeah, you're right. No. That's another big issue. And that's only the middle part. Before we get to the bit that you've all probably heard about in the last few days, the change in the law for the age limit in the Supreme Court. Now, talk to us a bit about that, Mike, and give us some background there as well. Remember, completely separate issue, but this is the last of the big judicial changes that have
because
gone.
The High Court, the Supreme Court opponent, is separate from the Constitutional Tribunal. The High Court is, well, the High Court, the Supreme Court, the end of all your appeals. Is where you come to when you really, really, really screwed up somewhere. And before, these judges would be basically chosen by all the other judges. They would send out nominations, but this was before PiS decided to change the way that the National Judicial Council was chosen. They decided to change the way the National Judicial Council was chosen, and they also said, like, oh, we want to get rid of all these judges that we don't know their background or that they were influenced by communists or whatever. And one of the ways they brought this in was by saying, like, the age of retirement will now be 65. So anybody over 65 is no longer a judge there. Boom. A lot of people are gone. And this technically is in line with the Constitution, because the Constitution says that when it comes to details like this, the legislative branch is the one that can decide. Okay, so you can argue about it, but that was fair enough. But the top Chief Justice, it says in the articles of the Constitution quite specifically that her term lasts 6 years.
Yes.
And a lot of people argue that no matter what other legislation says, that it's very specific.
And it's in the Constitution.
So even though the PiS is claiming that their changes of the law mean that she has to retire as well, other people are saying, like, no, it says specifically that her term lasts 6 years, which is another 2 years till April 2020. So she's still the top judge. The thing is, since so many other judges were gone, to choose a new top judge, you need a certain amount of those judges on the Supreme Court, which is made of tens of people. I don't even remember the exact number. But now PiS brought in 27 new judges, according to their new standards and new benchmarks. And now there are enough new judges to choose a new top judge. And when this new top judge is chosen, that's when things are going to get very interesting. Because now we have two top judges, and who's going to be the toppiest of the top judges.
Yes, and just to be clear about this, the top judge, to keep it simple, basically decides who gets what case, isn't
exactly.
that? And it's such a sacred responsibility. Yes. You know, I mean, when you think about it, it's massive. Like, you know, I mean, it should always be done in a kind of fair and honest, transparent way. So this is where I start to have trouble with this, because a lot of the other issues are complicated and knotty and procedural, but this one, not so much. This is, you know, the lower on the age. For me, it's heavy-handed. It's controversial. It's overreach to me. It feels wrong, and that's that. And I know I'm not a legal scholar.
It feels wrong, but it can be argued both ways.
It definitely could.
6-year term,
definitely could. The 6-year term, like you say, you know, it seems to me a pretty clear case of someone's in the right and someone's in the wrong. And I think a bit of patience on PiS's part when they made some of these changes would have been in order. And I also want to talk to you about something, right? Showing my ignorance here. In Ireland, we love referendums. We have them constantly. This seems like
if you don't get the right answer, you just do it again.
All right, okay. We're going to cover a bit of Lisbon Treaty stuff at the end. Save your powder, okay. But talk to me about referendums in Poland. Like, what? This seems like classic referendum territory to me.
Referendums in Poland really don't have that much of a tradition here. And the fact is that referendums in Poland are very difficult because you need a certain amount of people to come out.
You'd love them, they're great.
Like actually the president wants to introduce a new legislation when it comes to like referendums. And I personally am very for referendums in very specific cases though, because the referendum should be a yes or no. Are you for or against something very specific?
And this is complicated, so that's a good point. But I feel like Polish people are so engaged on this topic that it's classic referendum issue, because I think people have thought long and hard about this, and battle lines are kind of getting drawn. And the great thing about a referendum is the whole point of it is whoever loses has to kind of say, all right, we lost. You know?
Yeah, like it's happening in the... Oh, yeah. No.
Well, I mean, look, but in fairness, you know, I mean, there's been a lot of moaning and whining, sure, but, you know, there's been no talk of a rerun or anything. Well, there has been a lot of talk. Okay, but there doesn't seem to be any real chance of it
besides
happening.
all of that,
would you agree that there doesn't seem to be any real chance of it happening? I mean, doesn't this seem
Okay,
like
so we just do like a very, very brief diversion on this, because it's
absolutely, yeah.
Because you can argue the legitimacy of the Brexit referendum in the sense that it wasn't a 2/3 majority, but it was never stated it needed to be.
No.
But that was the referendum as stated, and that was the result. But later on, Theresa May, it was a vote in Parliament, and once Parliament has voted on Brexit, then that is the will of the people enacted through Parliament.
And it was a heavy vote in favour of.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. There's no chance of a second referendum. That's what my whole point was. Yes. Okay. Right. Back to...
Wait, what were we talking about again?
We were talking about referendums in Poland, Mike. So anything to further add to the referendum issue?
Well, you do have Cookies in Poland who's been talking about
That's
a referendum.
what I was thinking of, yes.
Exactly, too. Because he basically says, like, look, this is just proof that the system doesn't work, that our constitution is messed up, that the voting system doesn't really represent the people. Let's start a reset. Let's vote on a new constitution in Poland. Unfortunately, not a lot of people listen to him, but I think that the situation in Poland right now with the judiciary, with the courts, is just a sign that we're stuck in a rut. We've dug a hole. There's no way out. It's, burn our bridges and let's start all over again.
And that's why we tried to set up all that detail at the start about how this became the number one Polish issue, and it became such a hot button issue that action was needed to be taken. Possibly too much action, I would say. Possibly too clumsy, too quick. But at the end of the day, this is something we need to pull back a little bit here and say that whatever version of this system we end up with will have a precedent in the EU, a long-held precedent, because judges are appointed in different ways in every country in the EU. I mean, the real question is it a coup, as you keep hearing? And I honestly, I think most people based here would say that's a bit overblown. Like, would you?
I mean, I agree. I mean, this is a classic situation where they think the ends justifies the means. They want to do systems which don't go against EU standards whatsoever. It's the same way that judges are chosen, courts are structured in other different countries in the EU. They just try to introduce it quite heavy-handedly.
As I said, I wouldn't agree with the way they went about it, but it is important to point out that it's not exactly some unique unicorn from political outer space.
They don't want to create tribunals where it's just their people and with a gavel they decide who lives and who dies or anything like that. No, there are people in that party that believe that the system needs to be refreshed. I would argue that they're not doing it very well, but sorry for doing that little kind of uptone voice thing there.
Absolutely. If it's ever been a subject for a little uptone at the end of your sentence, it's this one. It's it's a sticky one. It's a tough one, and because it's always framed, an article is 800 words, and the writer has to get their basic point across, and that's why we wanted to do this deep dive. Is just to show the different stages along the way, how it started, what it's actually about, what's happening now, and moving on to our final segment, what the consequences might be, because there's no point pretending this isn't I'm not going to say global, but a regional issue at this point. I mean, there is a lot of concern in the rest of the member states about the political direction of, let's call them the V4, as we were discussing on the news. And where do you think the EU stands on being able to put Poland, as we say in Ireland, back in its box?
This is
Article 7. What do we think here?
This is hard to say because the EU obviously, instead of being an arbiter or stepping in trying to fix the problem, they've chosen a side.
Yeah. And
this annoys a lot of people on the other side.
And they've set a precedent now as well.
Yeah, it's like instead of being a fair arbitrator, they decided to choose one side. And which has ticked off a lot of people. I mean, me as well, because even though I'm anti-peace, I'm anti as well the EU choosing sides here.
Martin Schulz, president of the European Parliament, described this political situation in Poland as dramatic, with the latest actions of the Polish government having characteristics of a coup. A comment he's refused to back down from since, and that's the type of language. Just to interrupt with that quote, that's one of the absolute senior figures in the EU, and that's the type.
He's supposed to be a diplomat. He's supposed to be able to, work his political magic to get people to come together. And saying things like that, just proves what kind of an idiot he is. Or
but as we covered on the news as well, Poland likes to throw a lot of firebombs at Germany in the EU. So there is an element of them antagonizing.
Peace is definitely an all or nothing party.
Yes, they have a very strange political style. And I think that's what causes as much of the issues.
They like to antagonize. They like to escalate. They're the kind of party like, are you going to do that to us? Or we're going to do it back to you even, 10 times worse. Instead of realizing that they could take the high ground in a lot of these issues and, stiff upper lip and all that kind of stuff. But no. They decide to swing the mud right back, and which doesn't really help their cause whatsoever, but it does keep their base happy.
I'm conscious of not slipping back into complicated legalese and, stressing our listeners' brains out too much here, Mike. So I'm going to make a simple statement. I'm going to ask you to say, are you for it or against it? Essentially, Article 7 is structured in a way that there is fuck all the European Union can do, really, because they require unanimity. Is that fair enough?
That's fair enough to say, and I don't think the EU can really do much. They can just yell and scream and say how much they're against it, which just makes them look weak and makes peace look bad and doesn't really help the situation in any way whatsoever. It just drives people against each other even more so, drives people apart. We
were going to pull apart the whole, evolution of that process from Lisbon onwards to why there isn't actually a structural basis for the EU to really punish one of its member states in the way that they like to project that they actually can. But, at the same time as making that point, I would like to say to peace, de-escalate the fucking language here. Both sides could easily, as we said, Schulz is a major figure in the EU, it goes on both sides. But couldn't, these two sides just grow up a little bit? And,
why can't we all just get along?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, yeah. And that's, I think, I'd like to hand over to yourself for a conclusion here, Mike. What do you see going forward? What do you see the way out of this mess, or is there one?
Sad to say, I honestly don't really see a way out. This is going to just keep going until the media gets tired of the topic, switches to something else, and it's just going to be on the back burner. People are going to kind of forget about it.
Is that what Peace are counting on now that they've actually done it?
I don't know if Peace is counting on that or not. It's just gone to the point where even people that were protesting against this over the last few years here in Poland have also gotten tired of it. Nobody really cares that much. They've noticed that these changes are happening. They hear about it in the news, but for their day-to-day lives, they don't really see any changes or anything being altered, so they don't care that much anymore.
Yeah, well, I have to say my conclusion is, Josh, and I'd like to pass it over to you after this, is that I could easily see Peace losing an election in Poland, and henceforth all of this stuff wouldn't be as anywhere near as scary as people make out. And I just want to close on this from my point of view. People regularly conflate Poland with Hungary. I think that's fair to say. The Western media always talks about them nearly as the same thing. Doesn't Orban's party enjoy something like 70% of the vote in Hungary?
So
even more.
Here, yeah.
Peace have about 35, 40. They're the biggest party, but they're nowhere near the level of political dominance and majority type situation that gets projected in a lot of Western media outlets.
You brought up Hungary now, and for me that just reminds me of the fact that they keep talking.
We have to address it because they
keep talking about Poland being like a right-wing nationalistic country. Yeah. I'm like, no, they're not. So when they say that about Hungary, it's like, how am I going to believe you about Hungary then?
Well, that's another question. That's a whole other day's work. But we wouldn't, Josh, wouldn't you say it's fair to say you just can't read about Poland without reading about Hungary? You can't read about peace without hearing about Orban.
Oh, it's the same kind of tired trope that just resurfaces week after week in the far right nationalist populist governments like in Poland, Hungary, Turkey.
As I believe we've just shown, it's complicated, and it's not a new thing. This is a massive issue in Polish politics, and I hope we have illuminated it somewhat.
No, we haven't.
Okay, that was the KrakCast deep dive on the judiciary, which is a very hard word to pronounce, listeners.